Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to temporarily set aside the pending amendment so that I may call up my amendment 3585, which is at the desk.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Pennsylvania, Mr. Toomey, proposes an amendment number 3585.
I ask unanimous consent that we dispense with any reading.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me start by complimenting my colleagues, the chairman and the ranking member of this committee, for a genuine, sincere effort at a bipartisan solution to a difficult problem. There are things that I like in this legislation. There are things I don't like. But I do like the fact that, at least with respect to this legislation, at the moment the Senate is functioning, the committee was functioning and had a vigorous debate and discussion, came up with a reasonable approach. And I want to thank Chairman Wyden and Ranking Member Hatch for their cooperative effort to do this. But I want to address this particular amendment, Senate Amendment 3585. I want to thank my co-sponsor in this amendment, Senator McConnell. And what this amendment does, in short, Mr. President, is it allows communities that are recovering from a natural disaster to rebuild damaged infrastructure without having to acquire, or maybe I should say reacquire, federal environmental permits. Now, there's no question, we all agree, it's vitally important that we protect our environment. I should point out there is nothing in my amendment that would change federal environmental permitting requirements for any new construction, nothing at all. We should also recognize that states have their own very substantial standards in place to protect their environments, including during the construction of transportation infrastructure projects. There is nothing in my amendment that would weaken in any way or change in any way any state environmental laws or regulation. But the fact is, Mr. President, our federal environmental permitting process for infrastructure is broken. It's too cumbersome, it takes too long, it's too costly. It's a huge problem. I think the most damning statistic I can think of, that I'm aware of anyway, is from the Federal Highway Administration itself, which in fiscal year 2011 estimated that on average, transportation projects require 79 months to complete the National Environmental Policy Act review process, the NEPA review process. 79 months, Mr. President. That's 6.5 years to get permission from the federal government to build a road or a bridge, or to rebuild an existing road or bridge that's been damaged. 6.5 years. That's often longer, sometimes a lot longer, than it takes to actually do the construction. And that's a problem. It's a problem because it just drives the cost up dramatically and unnecessarily. 2 weeks ago, constituents of mine in Northampton County, Pennsylvania, reported to my office that just one environmental survey for a small bridge repair, we're not talking some massive new Golden Gate Bridge here, we're talking a little bridge that's just going to be repaired. Just one of the environmental surveys was $21,000 alone. Senator Rob Portman, he reports that in Ohio, federal environmental permitting alone increases project costs on average by 20%. The reasons that these delays are so expensive is, all of these delays, all of these permitting requirements, they all require consultants to carry it out, all kinds of engineering and consulting fees that get paid, often on retainer over time. It also means that while waiting for a road or a bridge to be rebuilt or restored, there's longer commutes, there's a big detour, there's more consumption of gas. That's all a waste of time and money. And the bottom line is that projects cost more the longer they take. That's the reality. Fact is, recovering communities don't need to have to incur this extra cost. I'll give you an example. Again, in Pennsylvania, since 2010, federal environmental permitting has delayed 9 projects by over a year. The Cherry Creek Bridge in Monroe County, Pennsylvania. This is an area that's flood prone. It was struck by Tropical Storm Lee and Hurricane Irene in 2011. And the reconstruction for the damaged transportation infrastructure should have started pretty much right away. But Fish and Wildlife Review delays alone cost us 2 years before construction could even begin. So, Senator Ben Nelson recognized this problem. A Democrat from Nebraska who served in this body recognized the problem and offered a bipartisan amendment to the last highway bill, MAP 21. What his amendment would have done, it would exempt roads and bridge repair projects from federal environmental permitting if the road and bridges were destroyed by a declared emergency, such as Superstorm Sandy, for instance, and provided that the reconstruction would occur entirely within the footprint of the existing structure, the original footprint. Unfortunately, Senator Nelson never got his vote. He was denied a vote. Instead, he got a watered-down provision put into the final bill that allows the Department of Transportation, under certain circumstances, to exclude certain repair projects from this whole process. But they can't make that exclusion if the project is deemed to be controversial. Undefined. I don't know what that means. And the exclusions don't apply to the Army Corps of Engineers or the Fish and Wildlife Services, the reviews of which constituents tell me these are the most time-consuming, cumbersome, and costly to comply with. The result is that recovering communities today, after they've been hit hard by a natural disaster, after they've incurred damage to their roads, their bridges, their infrastructure, they don't know what environmental standards are going to apply to them, except that some certainly will, and others may or may not be exempted. It still leaves them subject to a lengthy, costly, and unnecessary procedure because, once again, Mr. President, let me emphasize, we're talking about roads and bridges that are already there. We're not talking about new infrastructure, new capacity. We're talking about rebuilding what was already there and what was damaged. And so, Mr. President, this amendment that I'm offering, it's almost identical to the Nelson Amendment. The difference is, at the request of SEPTA, which is the Southeast Pennsylvania Transit Authority, it's been expanded to include not just roads and bridges, but also rail and transit facility repair projects. That's it. So it simply says these existing transportation infrastructure facilities, if they are damaged or destroyed by a declared natural disaster, the rebuilding, the identical rebuilding in that very same footprint, shouldn't be subject to going through the whole environmental permitting process all over again. That's all it says. I'm glad to have the endorsement of a number of organizations and groups, Associated General Contractors, National Association of Counties, Americans for Prosperity, Americans for Tax Reform, Citizens Against Government Waste. Mr. President, I would argue this is just common sense. This is a modest, narrow amendment. As I say, it doesn't in any way, shape, form, or fashion change any regulations or permitting requirements for any new construction. And it says nothing whatsoever about the extensive state requirements. It's silent about all of that. It simply says, with respect to federal environmental permitting, if you're rebuilding an existing road or bridge because it's been damaged in this way, that you don't have to go through this costly, lengthy process that is costing us time, money, jobs, and infrastructure. So, Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield the floor.